Okay, welcome to another episode of Critical Weight Theory. And today I am exploring one of the oldest and most powerful storytelling patterns ever created, the death rebirth motif. So, this theme appears in myths, legends, religious traditions, novels, films, and modern television, basically all over the storytelling landscape. Across cultures separated by oceans and centuries, storytellers have repeatedly returned to the same basic idea: something must end before something new can begin. A person, a belief, a way of life, or even an entire society experiences some sort of symbolic death, only to emerge transformed. So, why does this pattern resonate so deeply? Perhaps because it reflects something fundamental about the human experience itself, a sort of universal pattern, if you will. So, literary critic and scholar Northrop Frye devoted much of his work to identifying some recurring structures that appear throughout literature. In works such as Historical Criticism, Theory of Modes, Frye argued that beneath the countless stories humans tell lie some common narrative patterns and archetypes. Among the most significant of these archetypes is the death rebirth motif. Sorry, I screwed that line up. but you know what I mean. The death rebirth motif. And Fry saw such patterns not as coincidences, but as expressions of recurring human concerns. And regardless of time period or culture, people wrestle with loss, change, renewal, and transformation. Stories become a way of making sense of such experiences, and the death rebirth motif functions as a symbolic framework through which authors explore redemption, transformation, and the interconnected relationship between endings and beginnings. At its core, the message is pretty simple. Growth often requires letting go of who we once were. And one label for this is the crucible of suffering, which is a word that I enjoy, even though it's the word crucible. That's one of those words where even though I know what it means, I find myself still needing to actually look up the definition again. You know what I mean? It's one of those frustrating words. Like, I know what a crucible is, but I often need to look it up again just to make sure it's the right word. But one reason this motif remains so powerful is that transformation rarely comes easily. In many stories, the death phase is not necessarily physical death, although it can be. Instead, it may take the form of exile, humiliation, failure, grief, or the collapse of an old identity, and the character reaches a breaking point. Everything familiar is stripped away. The beliefs that once guided them no longer work. The status they once enjoyed disappears. Their assumptions about themselves and the world are shattered. So a lot of us have been through situations like that in real life, you know? Who hasn't had some sort of transformative phase? And this period functions as a crucible, a trial by fire. The old self must be dismantled before something new can emerge. Anyone who has experienced a major life transition can recognize a pattern like that. The end of a career, the loss of a loved one, the dissolution of a relationship, or a profound personal failure, all of those can feel like a kind of death. Yet, these moments often become the starting points for unexpected growth. And like I said, sometimes it might be a literal death, like if it's a death of a loved one. Obviously, that kind of death is a little bit more literal than the other ones. So, who hasn't or who won't at some point experience the loss of somebody that they cared about? Well, I think the vast majority of us on the planet. So that's why these stories really do have a purpose, and these patterns are just always going to be there so long as people tell stories. Because stories dramatize this process, because it reflects a reality that many people encounter in their own lives. And then there's the idea of redemption through renewal. It's another important function of the death rebirth motif. It's the connection to redemption. By symbolically killing off an old identity, authors create space for characters to begin again. And this doesn't mean the past totally disappears. Rather, the lessons of the past become the foundations for a better future, or something like that. I, I suppose the story isn't always one of redemption, but I mean, it could be of decline too. But in a lot of cases, it is about redemption. The character gains wisdom through suffering, mistakes become teachers, failures become opportunities for growth. The old self dies, but the experiences remain, and this allows stories to explore forgiveness and moral transformation. Characters who once acted selfishly, cruelly, or foolishly can evolve into something better. A redemption arc, that's something that you can see in real life too. I actually have experienced redemption arcs in my own life. I've known other people who have gone through redemption arcs. So it's something that can happen in real life. And the audience witnesses not just change, but it's a sort of earned change. Transformation feels meaningful because it comes at a cost. And it also has to do with cycles of nature and time. The death rebirth motif, it mirrors patterns found throughout the natural world. Winter gives way to spring, night gives way to dawn, seeds disappear beneath the soil before some new plant emerges, forests burn and eventually regenerate, or at least you would hope so. So, throughout human history, people have observed these recurring cycles and incorporated them into their myths and their stories. Sometimes it could be a creation story or something like that, or maybe an end of the world type of story. And the message embedded within these natural rhythms is that endings are not always final. Sometimes they are prerequisites for new beginnings. Isn't that poetic? Isn't that nice? And this cyclical understanding of existence appears in countless religious traditions, philosophical systems, and literary works. It suggests that life is not simply a straight line, but a series of transformations, each one ending contains the possibility of a renewal. And isn't that nice? Like, don't we always want things to be like that? Like, if there is a hurdle in front of you, you don't want it to stop you permanently. You want to be able to transform yourself by leaping over that figurative hurdle and transforming yourself into some type of hero who has a redemption arc or whatever. Just some sort of sense of victory, some sort of sense of continuation that good might triumph over evil, all of that kind of stuff. And I'm sure there might be some examples of the death and rebirth story that actually have a negative ultimate lesson or something like that, like a sort of pessimistic development toward the end. But most of them seem to have some sort of like positive trajectory to them. And some classic examples, some of the most influential works of literature have that archetype. So I've never actually read it, but the ancient epic of Gilgamesh, there's a character named Enkidu, and the death of Enkidu forces Gilgamesh to confront mortality for the first time, and apparently the loss devastates him, sending him on a quest for immortality. Although he ultimately fails to escape death, spoiler alert, he gains wisdom and compassion, and the proud and often tyrannical ruler is transformed into a more thoughtful and humane king, or something like that. That's how I've seen it summed up. And of course, generally speaking, you get the image of the phoenix rising from the ashes. That would be another example of a sort of death and rebirth. And Another classic holiday tale has this too. In A Christmas Carol by Charles Dickens, Ebenezer Scrooge undergoes a symbolic death of his former self. The ghostly visions that he experiences compel him to confront the consequences of his greed and his chosen isolation. And by the story's conclusion, the old Scrooge is effectively gone, replaced by a generous and compassionate individual. So that is actually sort of a death and rebirth story, if you think about it. And a similar transformation occurs in The Lord of the Rings when Gandalf falls while battling the Balrog. His apparent death becomes, I said becomes kind of weird, becomes a moment of profound renewal. So he returns as Gandalf the White, representing a higher level of wisdom, authority, and spiritual power. And it might be a little bit of a compelling moment to see Gandalf return. It's like a new and improved version of Gandalf, and it's kind of what makes those movies iconic is that you have some classic themes like this as a part of them. And all of these types of stories differ greatly in their setting, their style, and historical context, yet they all rely on some of the same underlying structures. Something must be lost before something greater can emerge. And of course, you got the hero's journey aspect. The death rebirth motif is often quite central to what scholar Joseph Campbell famously called the hero's journey. In this narrative framework, the hero leaves the familiar world and enters the unknown. And along the way, they encounter trials, dangers, and moments of profound crisis. And at the center of the journey often lies a symbolic death. And I suppose it might be a literal death too, if that's what the story entails. And Campbell referred to this stage as entering the abyss. The hero confronts their deepest fears and limitations, and in many cases, the person who began the journey cannot survive what comes next. A new self must emerge. Only after passing through this often symbolic death can the hero return home transformed, bringing some new formed wisdom back to their community. And whether we're talking about ancient myths, fantasy epics, or modern films or TV shows, the structure continues to shape countless narratives. And that's because it's something that people need. They need some sort of psychological and spiritual transformation, for lack of a better word. Now, I hesitate to even use the word spiritual because that carries a sort of religious connotation. But let's face it, there's some validity to the word spiritual in general if we just mean like what is essential to a being. That could be called the spirit or the inner core of that being, whatever we're talking about. It could be a human being, or if it's a fictional character, it could be a space alien or something. Whatever you're talking about, that is a part of the story. And the appeal of the death rebirth motif extends beyond literature. Psychologically, it reflects how people deal with major life changes. Many spiritual traditions describe periods of profound uncertainty, suffering, or self examination as necessary stages of growth. And sometimes this experience is called a dark night of the soul, a period when old certainties dissolve and a new understanding of life must emerge. And the motif recognizes a difficult truth. Transformation often requires surrender. People cannot always carry their old identities into new stages of life. Sometimes you have to get a new a new leash on life. You have to let go former relationships that you used to have that you relied on, things like that. You enter a new stage basically. Growth frequently involves releasing outdated beliefs, habits, and assumptions. And boy, does that ever seem relevant to a lot of the modern world. Now, I'm not going to get too specific about that, but I'm just going to throw that out there, and you can make of that observation what you will. And in this sense, the archetype speaks not only to fictional characters, but really to all of us. It's a bit about societal renewal. The pattern can also operate on a collective level. Entire societies sometimes experience crises that force fundamental change. Political systems collapse, institutions are reformed, communities recover from tragedy, or they at least try to the best that they can. And, periods of upheaval can create opportunities for renewal and reinvention. Stories that employ the death rebirth motif remind us that destruction and creation are often interconnected, even if they're not, conveniently done that way. It's not always like these stories are easy to understand, or like real life events that have destruction are easy to understand. Sometimes terrible things happen for no apparent reason, but you got to roll with the punches. And it's like the modern world. Like I remember, I'm going to get a little bit, deep here and a little bit disturbing. But when I was in high school, I remember the Columbine shooting, right? And it seemed to me at the time like, wow, this is about as bleak as it gets. I don't know if things are going to ever be normal after this. And that was when those types of mass shootings seemed like rare events. But now we have so many mass shootings and things that it's hard to see them as being as dark as they were in the past. They've just become normalized. So I don't know if that's really a death and rebirth story exactly, but it shows that over time, we've sort of toughened up, and like hardship and tragedy, it's created a hard outer shell. And I don't know if that's for the best, but it's definitely a part of our story. If you really want to look at it from a broader view of things, all of these wars over the decades and decades, well, really the millennia of mankind, but within my lifetime, it's been decades of experiencing these crazy and disturbing events. But I can't be sad each and every time one of these things happens. Like you can't be weeping and crying every single day, um, every time you read a newspaper or see a news clip. So I mean that's part of my own story arc, and it's part of our own collective story arc too. In a lot of cases, it's one of the reasons people sometimes decide, what, I can't watch the news anymore, because their own story is just it's just to blaze an independent trail, and you know, basically become like a perhaps non literal hermit in the hills and just ignore the modern world and all that kind of stuff. So some people do that, and that's part of their story. So see, like all of these things, they have almost like some sort of death and rebirth aspect to them. Like every major change that happens in history, um, like that seems like if there's a devastating event that could crush an entire society, well, if that society survives, even even a real life event can seem to have this death and rebirth cycle to it. And it's disturbing and it's crazy, but nevertheless, that's a part of history. While loss can be painful, it can also create the conditions for growth and transformation. I guess part of the problem is that hindsight is not always 2020. You don't always learn from the past, so that's why it's kind of important to try to learn from history, try to understand what these types of stories and narratives are ultimately trying to tell us. Because if we don't learn from the past, then of course we're, as the saying goes, doomed to perhaps repeat it. And this perspective doesn't glorify suffering. Instead, it acknowledges that change is an unavoidable part of existence. And, it's just a dark reality that if you're constantly paying attention to tragedy and dwelling on terrible events all the time, it can become overwhelming. So sometimes we need fiction to put these horrible events into perspective so we can better be mentally equipped to cope with them and possibly to forge a new path through all the death and destruction and the despair and the meaninglessness. We have to kind of create a new meaning to the extent that's possible, and try to create our own narratives to actually create a sort of heroic journey through the I guess the madness and the uh, just sheer insanity that surrounds us. And the death rebirth motif remains one of the foundational archetypes of world literature because it captures a universal human reality. We all encounter endings, we all experience loss, we all face moments when the person we once were can no longer carry us forward. Yet these stories offer a hopeful insight. Endings are not always the end, at least not for everybody. They can be beginnings, and renewal is possible. The old self may have to disappear, but something stronger, wiser, or more compassionate might emerge in its place. And perhaps that's why audiences continue to find meaning in these stories thousands of years after many of them were first told. And of course, there are new variations on them as well. And beneath every ending lies the possibility of becoming someone new. Well, that's it. I've rambled enough. It's already like over 22 minutes of me talking here. And thanks for listening. I hope you enjoyed it. I know I kind of fumbled a few points here and there, a few words, but feel free to like and subscribe anyway. This is just uh, a podcast. I'm just recording my voice into a microphone. And until next time, keep reading, keep questioning, and keep exploring the stories that help us understand ourselves and the world around us.